urging us to enter more deeply into an authentic interior spiritual life. And most particularly, he has been urging upon us works of the Spirit as opposed to those of the flesh. And today's reading continues in the same vein. In prison because of his preaching of the gospel of Jesus, he sends a warning from his prisoner cells to the faithful at Ephesus, and indeed to the church everywhere across time and space. Walk worthy of the calling to which you have been called. That calling, that vocation is before all else rooted in the fullness of its internal source and sustenance, Jesus Christ, who is incarnate in the order of material creation, born the life of the world. It is Jesus Christ, model and fountain of all grace, who is both the inspiration and indeed the means for the true realization for which we have been given life at all. St. Paul warns us to maintain a behavior which is worthy of our calling. Above all, it is the interior assimilation of the supernatural gifts of faith, hope, and charity, cause and effect of all the other virtues, chief among which is that of humility. From the divine life with which faith plants, within us arises all the rest of the virtues by which we live as Christians in our daily contact with the world around us. Among these, as Paul names, are those of mildness and patience, the support of others by the charity by which Christ lives in us, and through our good works is extended towards others. Our calling also nurtures a spirit of unity, from which springs the peace of God. In truth, that elusive harmony of life and conscience, which escapes the grasp of every purely human effort and understanding. It is Christ, it is not the paradigms of modernity which give peace to a society. To behave according to our calling is therefore no vague sentiment urged upon us by Paul. It is rather a moral imperative of our faith, that it should be operative and true within us and our relations with others. Charity, so essential to the Christian vocation, is what moves us in our love of God to a generosity of spirit towards others. On the one hand, it demands us to avoid criticism and condemnation. It directs us to be silent when tempted to speak ill of others, to ridicule or humiliate them by remarks or personal judgments. Charity avoids involving ourselves in the sovereign affairs of others. Such critical behavior, as we all know too well, is typical of human conduct. This is, in fact, the bad fruit of fallen nature, which is compounded in us by habits of personal sin. In truth, as Paul says, true charity results in the bond of peace, which prevails among those of genuine goodwill. In the same vein, Paul also bids us to live according to our hope. There is so much in the disintegrating social order in which we live, which gives positive proof that we are most assuredly not the source of our happiness or salvation, that we should rely all the more readily upon the divine hope which God establishes in us as our faith professes. In confessing supernatural hope with our lips, we must bring forth its fruit by a daily conduct that is in line with what we say. In today's gospel account, the Pharisees were, as so often the case, seeking to draw the Lord into a trap of their own devising. So they asked him, which was the greatest commandment? In a penetrating response, Jesus answered by saying, the greatest commandment was to love God, which they, the Pharisees, claimed they did, but immediately added that there was a second one, just like the first, a commandment which the Pharisees certainly did not practice, and that was love of neighbor. Now, why is the second commandment like the first? Well, it is because in the practical order of human conduct, the second commandment of loving one's neighbor is the reflection in our common social life, in the world in which we live, as the means by which we concretely show forth our love of God, who lives beyond our touch, who lives beyond material existence alone. Now, this relationship between God and our neighbor is a sign of the incarnational love of the divine Trinity. When you look into a mirror and see the reflection of your face, that image cannot exist without you, since you and your image are the same thing, in a manner of speaking. Jesus says that if we claim to love God, there is a natural corollary or consequence, and that is we must recognize the presence of Him in others as well as in ourselves. And we must love both if we say we love God. For loving God requires our loving what He loves. And loving ourselves and loving our neighbor arises as a consequence of our being made in the image of the source of all love. When in fact, we do not fulfill this second commandment, we do not fulfill either the first. And this point is made when Jesus says, not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father. Deception, self-deception in religion is one of the most prevailing errors and failures of religiosity in the world in which we live. The practice of our true Catholic, Christian, and apostolic faith is not, then, simply an intellectual confession of doctrine which we believe. And we must believe the doctrine proposed to us, but rather the practice of our Catholic, Christian, and apostolic faith is an economy of grace by which we live ever more rightly ordered towards God and towards our neighbor according to the principles of the faith we profess. This is this incarnation, so to speak, the living out in the activities of our present world of what God teaches us what we must do. It is characterized by what Paul calls elsewhere, caritas non ficta, a true love of God. A love not fictional, not false, for God and for neighbor, for the love of God. A supernatural, self-dying, self-sacrificing love which is non ficta, not put on, not false, but truly operative and driven by true motives, God's motives. This charity is infused into us at baptism. It is augmented by the grace of the sacraments and actual graces received, aided and nurtured by our Christian conduct, and eventually become more and more deeply established in the habits of our faith and daily life. The motivation for loving one another, then, is firstly rooted in God, and secondly, in our recognition that we are all made in His image. If this be so, and it is, we must see in one another, despite the veil of sin which obscures that image in all of us, we must see in one another Christ Himself, for He, our head, continues to live in this present world in the flesh of His body, which is the church. That is to say, the membership of the church. And the church, comprised of its members, is relative to the absolute entirety of the human race. And why should that be? It is because everyone, without exception, is either a member of the church formally or stands in relation to it as a potential subject of becoming so. That from the instant of conception until death. Thus, we are bid by faith to love one and all, even our enemies. And all this Christ has done, and He has shown to us how to do through His own divine example. It is through this love we bear for others that we most surely manifest that we love God with our whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. And reason demonstrates that the contrary is also true. If we do not love one another, not only will the bond of peace be absent, that is so evident in the world in which we live now, evident in the divisions in the church, and as was certainly the case with the Pharisees, we reveal in fact that we do not really love God at all. And if this be the case, then we cannot really enter into the kingdom of heaven, even were we to possess faith sufficient to move mountains. Believing the doctrine of the church is not enough. We must conform to that truth, interiorly in our minds and exteriorly by a conduct which conforms to the faith of our revelation. Brethren, walk worthy of the vocation in which you are called. It is a very great consolation to know that all of Scripture, which is that great collection of words spoken by the one word, which is Christ, wisdom itself, finds its exegesis through its own interior harmony. Elsewhere Christ says, God requireth not the death of a sinner, but that he be converted and live. These are words of very great comfort. And I have come that you might have life in abundance, here, now in time, and of course in eternity. Now God knows the assimilation to ourselves of grace and true conversion is an arduous and lifelong process. So we must not be discouraged because we have not adequately lived up to this vocation to which we have been called. None of us, even the greatest of saints, have not done it perfectly. So rather, let us come again and again to the throne of grace, Christ, who is always ready to pardon. Let us go to him with humility, generosity of spirit, and patience in all of our struggles. Our religion and our struggles are intimately united. If the religion is true, it is by showing God hearts which are seeking to truly love him, that our love for him is the possession of him, not his consolations, not his gifts, not that he answers our every prayer, but that we will possess him, that we are pleasing to him. To such hearts he grants an increase of grace, and thus the strength needed for persevering in the world in our own individual lives, which we are living now in time. This is what is truly meant by living in the Spirit. By doing so, it will bring us, when God should will, to a share in the vision of him, in the glory of that world which for us is yet to come. Please rise.